switch in the motor pattern that is preferential to stability over mobility. All right? So when we look at these developmental changes, as the children grow, we get some qualitative changes in their running patterns because of the experience. Right? But also when they physically grow and mature, we should see an increase in the quantitative measure of running. So for example, speed will improve. But what we have to pay attention to is that faster, that speed, doesn't necessarily mean that their movement pattern is competent. It may be due to the fact that they've grown and matured somewhat. All right? So often when we look at adults, we still see a running pattern that is inefficient with pretty low-level characteristics, even though they're adults, right? Because they may not practice running. Okay? The same thing happens with running, but to a greater extent that we see with walking when we look at the elderly population. All right, the pattern, the movement pattern changes because of the changing constraints to something that is more stable and is going to help them maintain their balance. All right, so we see a decrease in stride length. They take a shorter step. And the rate limiter may be range of motion in the hip joint. Right? We also see a decrease in the number of strides they'll take and the speed. So the rate limiter there could be a decrease in strength, perhaps. But if we maintain physical activity, and if we're lucky enough to not have a propensity for arthritis and kind of degenerative diseases that have some genetic element to them, then we could see, oops, I want that one, and I went too far. We could see people running into their senior years. So hopefully this video will work. I forgot to check this one. Here we go.
We are just a few sleeps away from the Good Life Fitness Victoria Marathon, and if you are running the 8K, the half, or the full marathon, you will see all sorts of people from different walks or runs of life out on the course. And Hans Sandberg proves that this event is for runners of all ages. Yes, Hans Sandberg won't be the fastest participant in this year's half marathon, but he also will not be the slowest, which is pretty impressive because he is 89 years young. He is the oldest runner in the event. The former gymnast took up running late in life. Now, Hans hasn't always been the picture of health, a former smoker and drinker. Sandberg's own 12-step program was literally a matter of putting one foot in front of the other.
I gave up smoking a long time ago, and I used to have a few drinks, but all that I gave up. I run 3 times a week. My run is usually 5K, along Dallas Road. It's a lot of fun. Now, these are the medals of the 10Ks. Keeps me happy and keeps stress away from you, no tension. You feel free and you enjoy life better.
Go get him. Hans will see you on the course this weekend.
Every time I watch that, it blows me away. Okay, so with the elderly, a smaller change in constraint doesn't take a big change in for example, a structural constraint for us to see quite a dramatic impact on the motor pattern. Okay, so those small changes can impact later running. I mean, I think that gentleman has done an amazing job to change his lifestyle from being a smoker and a drinker to that. But also, he looks like he's not got arthritis in his hips or in his knees, which, considering he was a gymnast, is amazing in and of itself. Right? So he looks otherwise pretty healthy, given the lifestyle that he used to have. Okay? So we feel, I think, that for a lot of individuals, they may be able to run, but they might not have the opportunity to do so, or they might not think that's something that they should be doing at that age, right? If their doctor isn't encouraging them to be that active, then they may feel, well, you know, 85-year-olds don't go out and run around the streets. I mean, that might be dangerous. I might get hurt, right? So again, it comes back to that idea that I mentioned earlier in the semester, that we don't have a lot of research on what is appropriate for this age group. What can we expect? What's normal? What's the range of normal? How hard can we push them to be that active, right? I mean, my mum couldn't have achieved that. She had 2 hip replacements, a knee replacement, ulcerative colitis, cancer. Yeah, well, that wasn't going to happen. Trying to get her to walk down the garden and back was like pulling bleeding teeth. And she had a cane and a walker. It was like pulling teeth. It was from here to the door. Could not get her to do it. I mean, I think it would have helped. But, well, you know, I mean, it's really difficult with that older population. All right, so I want to go over a new assessment tool that they have in our textbook. All right, so far we've got our MSU chart, our TGMD. All right, this one is another assessment that is based upon the idea of stages of development, okay, within a skill. And so what they do initially is they decide which are the major components, which are the major actions that occur within a skill. And then they create developmental stages for that action. So it's like a glorified MSU chart for every piece of the action rather than the whole skill. All right? So back at the beginning of the semester, I said that MSU and TGMD were total body approaches. Right? The one that is in our textbook is called a component approach, because it looks at all these separate parts of the skill rather than the skill as a whole. Okay? So for some of the skills, it's very simple. For some of the skills, it's a lot more complicated. Running is relatively simple. They decided that they're just going to look at leg action and arm action, and that those are the 2 things that are important to running. Right? And they created several steps for arms and legs. All right? So on page 133, you have the developmental sequence. It says it's hypothesized because the work that was done on the MSU chart with thousands of children and thousands of hours of video analysis hasn't been done on the observation plan. The people who came up with the observation plan are extremely experienced at motor development, so it's a pretty good bet that this is what you would see. All right? So then they take that developmental sequence and they turn it into an observation plan that would be an easier tool to use if you were watching someone running. Okay? And we don't have the kind of age limits on the observation plans because we don't have the research validating it. So, you know, it's almost like you could use it with any age. Okay? So what they do, and you can't see it, I'll make it a bit bigger. Oh, I don't know if I can, or I can do it bigger on here. See if this will work. But it's on page 137 in your textbook. Okay. So what they do is they take their developmental sequence for legs, all right, and they turn it into a series of yes-no questions. So it's kind of like your TGMD analysis when you're looking for that characteristic. Do they do it or not do it? Yes or no? They get a 0 or a 1. It's the same idea, okay? So leg action, the first question they ask, and when you're looking at the observation plan, you want to flip back to the developmental sequence so you can see the connection between the question and what they expected the next step to look like, okay? The first question is, watch from the side. Is there flight between the steps? Simple yes-no question, right? Either there is or there isn't, okay? So, if you say no to that question, they label that a pre-run. Because remember we said that one of the definitions of running is there has to be a flight phase. So if there's no flight phase, it technically isn't running. Right? So they call it a pre-run. If you answer yes, that's not the end of what is happening with the legs and the feet. So we have another question to ask. Okay? So question number 2 says, does the knee flex to at least 90 degrees on the recovery swing? So does the foot that leaves the floor push hard enough that what we get is a 90-degree or smaller angle as the leg swings through? Okay? So, again, relatively simple yes-no question, particularly if you're using a camera and you can either slow it down or stop it and take a look. Right? If you say no to that, they say that is step 1. Right? Means that there's minimal flight and it's possible the person is running relatively flat-footed, because as soon as you've got a heel toe, the push off the toes is really pretty strong. So you should see a relatively tight angle on the leg swing. Right? So step 1, minimal flight, possibly flat-footed. Right? That's still not the end of what we expect to see in a run. So there's another question. If I say yes to that question, the next question is, watch from the front or the rear. Does the swing leg remain primarily in the forward-backward plane? Right? So does this leg leave the floor and swing here, right? Or am I applying force, kind of skewy, and getting a weird heel kick on the swing leg? Right? So, step 2, if I say no, it's not in the frontal plane. Step 2 is a crossover swing. If I say yes, they say that's direct projection. And this group of researchers said that's the mature version of what I expect the foot action and the leg action to look like. And they stopped there. You might agree or not agree. As I said, it hasn't been validated with film and thousands of people. Right? But they decided that was what they wanted to see. Okay? And then they do the same thing with the arm action. So they create a yes-no question. No is step 1, yes is another question. No is step 2, yes is another question. No is step 3, yes is step 4. Alright? So this then becomes the tool that you would use to watch someone, and because it's easier to use than all the words that are in the table in the developmental sequence. Right? So the developmental sequence kind of describes it, but the observation plan gives you the tool for grading it. Right? The benefit of the component approach is that it gives you as the teacher or the coach a much larger slice of information about what this individual is doing in this skill, right? Versus a total body approach. The drawback to the observation plan, to the component approach, is that it takes longer because there's more to it. But you get a lot more information, right? So it might depend on who you're working with. There's very few of these observation plans available. It's a tool that you will have to develop for yourself. So we're going to practice that next week or the week after, I can't remember. It's on the schedule. And that will be a piece of work that we'll do in class, but it has grading points assigned to it. Right? So make sure that you're looking at these observation plans in the chapter as we go along, because I'm not going to go through every single one of them, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at them and getting the idea of them so that when we do it in class, you can produce something that is similar, okay? All right, so it's basically a developmental sequence for important components within the skill. Right. So we've done walking, we've done running. The next block of locomotor skills are jumping, hopping, and leaping. And these all involve propelling yourself off the ground or off an object. Okay. Jumping means that the individual is landing on 2 feet, and typically we expect them to take off 2 feet, but if they take off 1 foot and land on 2 feet, that also counts. You generally don't see that on the floor unless one leg is stronger than the other, and so one leg goes earlier. But if they're jumping off of something, they will quite often take off of 1 foot and then land on 2 feet on the floor. Okay? Hopefully they land on 2 feet on the floor, because if they land on 1 foot, probably got an ankle or a knee injury. Right? So, alright, so jumping means I'm definitely seeing landing on 2 feet. I probably took off 2 feet. I might have taken off of 1 foot. Right. Hopping, you You've got to be careful when you're on the playground with the term hopping, because many, many, many people in this country, for some bizarre reason, no, it's not really bizarre, it kind of makes sense, but call this hopping, because I'm hopping like a bunny rabbit or a kangaroo. That's not hopping, that's jumping, right? Hopping is taking off one foot, landing on the same foot. Okay, so when you're on the playground, try really hard to use the right terminology. Leaping, some of you might have picked leaping for your TGMD assignment. Leaping is also taking off of one foot, but it is landing on the opposite foot. Okay? So hopping, I take off one foot, I land on the same foot. Leaping, I take off one foot and I land on the other foot. Usually we think of leaping as something that moves forwards. But I can also technically leap backwards. I can leap sideways. All right? It's usual to see it forwards. So, if the children are healthy, and if they're encouraged to play outside and to be active, then we might see some form of low-level jumping being attempted pretty young. Right? Adults can decide, am I going to do a jump that is moving forwards, like a long jump? Or am I going to do a jump for height, like a vertical jump? Okay. Young children can't do that because the brain has to be able to differentiate where it applies the force, right? So remember, if I'm going to move forwards, I have to push down and back. If I'm going upwards, I only have to push down. So when they're little, we tend to see jumping up and down and not a lot of long jump type action. Okay? Because that, I've got to be able to make the decision on how I'm going to apply the force, and that's quite difficult for the brain. It takes practice. Okay? We may see this one foot take off because one leg is stronger than the other. And generally, they don't remember to use their arms, they don't bend their legs very much, they just kind of try to jump. Page 138 has a table on it that gives you some norms. What are the approximate ages we expect to see different kinds of jumping and hopping? Okay. You can look, if you look underneath, this data is pretty old, so you might expect to see slightly younger children doing those activities now, but the sequence of the activity would be the same. Just might happen at a slightly younger age. The more practice we get, the more we grow, the stronger we get, the better the jumping becomes, and so we would expect to see some kind of leg bend before a jump, right? An arm swing. I'm not going to show you these videos, but they do, both of them give a good visual for looking at early jumping versus something that's more proficient. But I've got another piece of video that I want to show you at the end. All right, so please go back, when you're looking at these notes, go back and watch the pieces of film because it gives you the picture that goes with the words. All right? So, looking at the changes that we see with development then, we've got a similar situation to what happens with the running. If the child is growing and getting stronger, their jumping height or their jumping length improves. So the quantitative improvement may not be due to qualitatively improved motor patterns. Could just be because they grew. So you've got to be very careful when you're assessing. It's one of the problems with, do I assess the outcome or do I assess the process? Right? You have to make that decision, and it might depend on who you're working with. If I'm working with elite athletes, what they look like as they jump to dunk the ball is bleeding irrelevant. I need them to dunk the ball, right? So all I care about is the outcome, who's going to jump the highest and get the ball in the net. But if I'm working with kids at a basketball camp, or a PE group, or a recreational center, maybe I want to work on what are you actually doing, because ultimately the technique will improve their jumping. So you have to make some decisions when you're the one in charge. What is it I'm looking for? What are the goals of the program? Right? What do I need this individual to do and why? Okay? So, we have two sets of sequences going on. All right? The first one we have is our MSU chart, our TGMD, our observation plan. Right? It's called the intra skill sequence. What is the developmental sequence within? Intra means within the skill. Now we're starting to look at sequence set number 2, which is the inter-skill sequence. Inter means between, right? So intra-skill sequence is what's the developmental sequence within the skill. So I see this, then this, then this, then this. Intra, within. I see walking, I see running, I see jumping, then I see hopping, typically. Inter-skill sequence. Right? I would not expect to see hopping before running. I wouldn't expect to see hopping before jumping because I need to be strong enough to get off the ground using both legs before I'm going to be strong enough to get off the ground using just one leg. So it's a logical progression. Right? And the characteristics that we're looking at here are very similar to our characteristics on our MSU chart. The support leg is lifted up in the air rather than doing something to help with the hop. Right? Arms aren't really doing anything at all, they're just kind of stuck out, usually to the side. and the swing leg is very rigid, it doesn't move around. Versus someone who's been hopping for a while, my swing leg might be helping with the hop, right? The support leg is going to extend fully because I'm strong enough to push all the way through. If I'm trying to hop forwards, you might see some oppositional arms, although that's very advanced. Okay. And I'm strong enough to absorb the landing on one foot. So I don't collapse as I land on the floor. And again, we've got someone who is too old to be hopping as badly as he does in this video. So look for that, right? Because this child is not 3 or 4, okay? And this hop is not very good, okay? Versus someone who's hopping very proficiently, all right? So again, make sure when you're looking at these notes that you go back and at your website for the book, there's tons more opportunity to look at examples of all these skills on video. The more you watch, there's a reason your coaches have you watch video, right? Because watching supplements hearing and seeing words, right? Seeing movement supplements seeing words. So watch as much of the video as you can because it will really help you try to understand what the chapter is explaining here. So, we wouldn't expect the toddlers to hop several times. Actually, you'll be pushing your luck to get the young 3-year-olds to hop several times. And we probably cannot get Jason or Kayla to hop more than a couple of times. It's going to be interesting to see how able they are to hop given their size. So there's lots going on in the brain at this point, trying to moderate the force of landing, control that landing, right? Not collapse, be able to land, absorb, and then explode again. So the brain has to reverse what the muscle tissue is doing, right? So there's lots and lots of learning going on subconsciously in the brain to control hopping. So walking, running, jumping, hopping, leaping, then we get the next block. And the next block are unique in that they are combinations of these previous skills. Right? So they're much more complicated for the brain to organize. I have to be able to hop and leap in order to gallop, slide, or skip well. Okay. Galloping is the first in the sequence. And galloping is an asymmetric skill. And it's asymmetric because both legs don't do the same thing. If you remember, we talked about the 50% phasing for walking and running, because both legs do 50% of the work and the action is the same. But in galloping, right, in galloping I am moving forwards, my front leg is always in front, my back leg is always at the back, so my front leg does the push, my back leg does the land. My front leg does the push, my back leg does the land. So these legs are doing two completely different things now. So my brain has to tell one leg to do one thing and the other leg to do something different. That's hugely complicated. Okay? Sliding is number 2 out of this block. It's like galloping, except it's sideways. And it's also asymmetric because the leading leg does the push, the trailing leg does the land. I have found that some children, particularly if they don't take a dance class, right? And generally, the dads around here are too much into their football and their baseball to take the boys to dance class. So not many of the boys get to go to dance class, unfortunately. It's very, very good for you. Galloping is very difficult for them. Sliding, because you see this in sport, they have a visual of what sliding looks like. And so it's a little odd because technically galloping is first and sliding is second. But on the playground you might find that what you get is something that's kind of in between. They can't quite go forwards. They don't want to go blind sideways. They want to look where they... And it all kind of gets mushed up. It's quite odd. The last one is skipping. It's the most complicated. I have to step and hop, but it's now symmetrical because both legs do the same thing. Okay? I step and hop on my right, I step and hop on my left. Okay? The most fun skill. Everybody should skip. So skipping is considered the most complex, fundamental locomotor skill. All right? Somewhere between, it's quite a wide range, somewhere between 4 and 7 you might get skipping. All right? Girls generally are better at all these skills than boys. Partly because of experience, because girls are encouraged to gallop and skip and boys are not, which is sad. Galloping and skipping are not girls' skills, they're everybody's skills. Right? Partly though because, remember we said girls are ahead of the boys maturationally. But there is this social constraint. We don't encourage boys to skip. Why? Why don't you skip? Do any of you skip? Ever? You skip? For warm-up.
Yeah,
Okay.
I do a warm-up for a while
Right.
to skip, isn't it?
Would you skip by choice?
No.
Just out in the park because it was a beautiful day?
Don't worry. Yeah.
See, skipping is a happy skill. It makes you feel good. It makes happiness kind of just evolve. You cannot be unhappy skipping. If you're in a bad mood, you should try it. It is absolutely impossible to be unhappy skipping. I'm convinced of it. So back to our idea of rate limiters then. Our rate limiters for galloping, a big one is coordination. Because the brain, because it's an asymmetrical skill, the brain has to uncouple the legs. And it's much easier to make both limbs do the same thing than it is to make one do one and one do something else. That's why the whole tummy head rubbing thing is tricky. And I've got differential force production because one is pushing and one is landing. Okay. Sliding coordination is also involved because they've got to go to the side. Technically, on sliding, I should be facing forwards, not looking where I'm going. Right? But that's uncomfortable for the brain because we're so visually dominant. It likes to be looking where it's going, right? So the neuromuscular system, the talking between the nervous system and the muscular system may limit development in these skills. Skipping is also coordination, but for a different reason. All right, now it's not that I uncouple the legs, it's that I have to do two different skills on the same leg. We wouldn't necessarily consider force production here, even though I have to hop in order to skip, because force production would have been the rate limiter for hopping, which came earlier. And I have to be able to hop in order to skip. So force production would be a rate limiter for hopping, but not for skipping. Does that make sense? Right? Because I should already have the force production sorted out by the time I get here. Remember, the rate limiter is the thing that's developing slowly, that's holding back my ability to do the skill. Okay? So, given that humans can move in all these different ways, right, why do we pick walking?
Social norm.
Social norm? I agree. That's a very big part of it.
Because it's weird seeing someone run in class.
You can't wait to get here. Right? Also, walking frees up our hands to explore. It also gives us a much bigger perspective of our environment. Right? Think about, try it out when you're at home and no one's watching, right? Because I don't want to embarrass you, right? Go around your house on hands and knees and see what you see versus what you see and what you're aware of by standing upright and walking bipedally. Okay? All right, so we could probably, if we were willing to sit here for half an hour, come up with many, many more ideas of why upright walking is a good plan and the most frequently chosen. But I just want to take the last couple of minutes, bless you, to show you a piece of film that turned the research world on its head. And the left-hand one off for me. This is a whole documentary that was on PBS several years ago, on Nova, which is possibly the best program on the planet. So it's almost 40 minutes long. I'm just going to show you a little clip, but you might want to go back and watch it because it is fascinating. And it calls into question all kinds of things that we know about development and genetically driven hardwired movement versus environmental input. I mean, it's really fascinating. So I'm going to scoot this forward. I think it was about 8 minutes. I found it good. Okay.
Good idea, Brigitte.
Rashid Ulash has fathered 19 children, a lot even by local standards in this remote Kurdish village.
Wonderful.
12 of them were born totally healthy, but 7 weren't, 6 of whom survive. And the first hint of the problem soon appears from down the road. This is Gulin. At first sight, he looks drunk. But he isn't. There's something wrong with his balance. Still, he's on 2 feet, not 4. But then, one by one, the other children appear.
How did you know?
There are 4 young women and 1 young man. Hussein has walked like this for 28 years. No one knows for sure when her ancestor stood up, but there are clues. One of the most haunting is this trail of human.
So, there's a big discussion because the people who are very genetically hardwired, information processing kind of approach, feel that what has happened is probably a defective gene that some of these children inherited and some did not. Whereas other people who take a more ecological approach say it can't just be genetic. There has to have been something going on that encouraged this group of children to produce that motor pattern and realize that that was the most effective way for them to get around. So it's a fascinating documentary. I highly recommend watching it. And as far as we know, there's no one else on the planet that walks like that. But that group of individuals were only located back in 2005, and they were kept secret for a long time while some research was done because people didn't want people going and kind of eyeballing them and you know, I mean, and you can tell by the way their faces are and their eyes are shaped that there are other cognitive deficiencies as well going on, I think. Although I don't know that for sure, but it looks that way. But yeah, fascinating. So we never do know what's out there. All right, guys, have a great weekend.